Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are looking at another class build in DeepRockGalactic, and today we are going to be talking about everybody's favorite bullet-spewing powerhouse, the Gunner. Today's build is a simple but very effective one that does not require a crazy amount of brain power, and it's a build that actually allows for a good amount of customization and flexibility depending on the specific setup you want to use. The main premise is that we are going to be lighting things on fire, more or less, and then spreading that fire to everything nearby. It's a great build for both crowd control and heavy single target damage if put in the right way, and the overclocks in question are not too complicated, so pretty much anybody can pick this up if they really wanted to. So if you guys are ready, let's go over the Burning Boomer build for the Gunner class in DeepRockGalactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload. So this build is one that utilizes both the Hurricane guided rocket system and the Arms Core coil gun in a nice combination that is effective at both dealing with groups of enemies as well as taking chunks out of the bigger threats. This build is incredibly easy to use and is also relatively flexible, as I'll go on to talk about later once we talk about the actual upgrades, but the build itself is pretty straightforward and it doesn't require too many crazy tricks. The main rotation is you're going to be using the rocket pod to fling a bunch of missiles into the enemy crowds to do a combination of stunning, damaging, and also igniting them on fire before switching over to your coil gun to be able to spread that fire in mass amounts of damage. The combination of these two weapons as well as the overall gameplay style allow this build to be useful in many different circumstances, from dealing with bots to swarms, to bigger enemies, to boss-like enemies. It can pretty much do just about anything that you want. The only thing it kind of struggles with is, of course, Dreadnought, because lighting them on fire is a bit tricky. But aside from that, if you want a build that uses the rocket pod and does not require a crazy amount of thinking power, this is a phenomenal build to use. Now, diving a little bit deeper into the gameplay style of the build itself, the main objective we have with this build is again to let loose a flurry of rockets that are going to deal heavy damage to anything that they hit, as well as also lighting certain enemies on fire, in which we will utilize that fire to spread even more fire and damage to basically everything nearby. The primer for all of this and our primary weapon is the Hurricane guided rocket system, which is a weapon that needs no introduction and is honestly pretty good just as is without any sort of major overclock. And because of that, we're not using an overclock that is very game-changing or very difficult to use. We're just using a standard fragmentary missiles to give our rockets a little bit more oomph to them. It also helps to accelerate the burning process, as we are using the napalm infused rounds most of the time, which I'll get into that a little bit later, in order to help light the enemies on fire. This is very effective as it only converts a certain amount of damage into fire damage, which isn't a huge loss, especially since the rockets do a heavy amount of damage already, and the fire does wonders at taking out smaller enemies or putting a good damage over time effect on bigger threats. But the main thing that we're using it for is to combo with our secondary weapon, the Arms Core coil gun. Specifically with the mod we are using in Tier 5, which is the Necrothermal Catalyst. What this does is it makes it so that way if you use this weapon to take out a burning enemy, it causes a massive explosion that deals both fire and normal damage. This can be great for clearing out groups of small or even big enemies, to be honest with you. Even if you have a big group of Praetorians, this can do wonders at taking them out. And the whole premise behind this build is to fuel that fire, either using the rocket pod or other tools that we have in the particular build. As I'll go on to discuss a little bit later when we talk about the weapons and equipment, you actually do have a little bit of flexibility in terms of what you want to use, which can give you several different ways that you can play this build out. Next, going into the actual loadout of the build, we of course have our perks to start off. For this build, I'm playing it very simply with the standard setup that I like to use. For passives, I'm running Resupplier, Born Ready, and Thorns. If you've watched any of my build videos in the past, you know that this is what I refer to as the holy trinity of passive perks. You can basically use these three perks on just about any build, do wonders for you. Resupplier helps keep you topped off on ammo. Born Ready makes it so that way you have to reload less, which helps with uptime and damage, especially on this build. And Thorns is just great for keeping those small threats off of you. For active perks, I'm running Dash and Field Medic. Dash is of course phenomenal, especially on Gunner because he is very low mobile. And Field Medic is great on Gunner specifically because using his shield, he can get people up very quickly. But if you did want to swap out Field Medic for Iron Will, that would work out fine too. So talking about the weapons and equipment, normally I would talk about the grenades here, but I'm actually going to save that for a little bit later as it plays into something that we are going to actually have to choose between later on down the line. So then first, starting off with the primary weapon, we are of course using the Hurricane guided rocket system. A weapon that is very powerful on its own, even without any overclocks at all. The Hurricane is a great weapon for taking out big groups of enemies, as well as being able to do sustained damage towards those big singular threats. with doing good area damage, having a mixture of kinetic and explosive damage, and the rocket being able to be steered make it a very friendly and easy to use weapon. And as I said before, the Hurricane really does not need too many crazy overclocks to make it strong because it by itself is very powerful. So for our purposes, we are using a very simple overclock with the fragmentation missiles. This just gives you a little bit more area damage and a little bit of a bigger area of effect radius, which makes the missiles a little bit stronger. That's really all you need in order to make this build more effective. And if you did want to upgrade to something else, such as mine layer system or even rocket barrage or jet fueled homebrew, that could also probably work. But I just wanted to keep this build very simple for somebody who maybe hasn't used the Hurricane a whole lot. And the fragmentation missiles already make this weapon incredibly strong. It gives you even more better crowd control than the Hurricane already has, and it makes it so that way the explosives of the missiles themselves are even more effective. And to make the rocket pod even more effective beyond that, in the first tier, I chose the increased blast radius just to lean into the overclock a little bit more. In tier 2, I chose the bigger jet engine just to give us a little bit more velocity to make the rockets hit sooner. In tier 3, I chose the improved feed mechanism to give us a little bit of a faster rate of fire. If you wanted to, you could choose the extra magazine size if you are okay with the rate of fire of the Hurricane normally, as we do reload relatively often, but that's also why we're running Born Ready. In tier 4, I chose zip fuel just to further increase our area damage to help lean into what we're trying to do. And in tier 5, you actually have one of two options that you could choose. And this kind of leans into what I was talking about earlier with the grenades. There's actually two setups that you can use with the Hurricane depending on how you want to run it. Remember, the main objective that we're trying to do is light enemies on fire so that way we can lean into it with the coil gun. And there's two actual ways that we can apply fire to the enemies. Now, the first way you could do this is by taking the napalm-infused rounds that I mentioned earlier, which just converts some of the damage that the Hurricane does to heat damage. This is probably one of the most straightforward ways and requires you to have as little brain power as possible in order to use this. And if you wanted to go with this particular style, for grenade choices, I would actually go with the Tactical Lead Burster because it's just a very good grenade for taking out those big, heavily armored threats, bulks, or just basically anything else big that you want to take out. However, there is another way that you could do this. Another powerful tier 5 option for the Hurricane is the uncontrolled decompression, which makes it so that way your rockets can stun enemies for a good amount of time. And this is a very powerful mod that some people just cannot stop using for the Hurricane, and I completely understand. And if you wanted to use that, you absolutely can, as it is really good for crowd control, but then you have to have a source of fire in order to lean into the coil gun. So if you were going to take the stun chance for the Hurricane, I would then change your grenade to the incendiary grenade so you could have a steady source of fire. Keep in mind, we are going to be able to burn enemies with the coil gun itself, but it's just a little bit easier if we have something that is able to apply the burn effect initially before we bring out the coil gun. If you are confident that you're able to light enemies on fire with the coil gun itself, and then you use the necrothermal catalyst without too much issue, then you don't need to worry about either one of these and can just sort of run whichever one you want. But for me personally, I felt it was a little bit more consistent using the napalm-infused rounds and then running the tactical lead bursters for the bigger enemies. Next, going over to our secondary weapon, as stated, we are using the Arms Core coil gun, which is, as I have said many times before on the channel, probably one of the most irresponsible secondary weapons in the entire game. Seriously, I don't know how R&D was able to pass this. In any event, this weapon does two things for us. One, it is really good for taking chunks out of those bigger enemies, and second, it is great for clearing out groups of enemies, whether they be big or small, thanks to a combination of our overclock, which in our case is going to be Hellfire, and its tier 5 mod called Necrothermal Catalyst, which is actually what I'm going to start with. Basically, what this mod does is it makes it so that way you deal extra damage towards burning enemies, and also if you use the weapon to kill a burning enemy, it will cause a massive explosion that will damage any enemy nearby. This is great for taking out swarms of enemies, whether they be big or small, and it is the main goal that this build is trying to accomplish when it comes to dealing its heavy amounts of damage. Again, you light enemies on fire with either the Hurricane or the incendiary grenades, whichever you're trying to use, or both if you just want to channel your inner driller, and then you use the coil gun using its necrothermal catalyst to blast anything nearby said burning enemy. Now, to help with the coil gun, the overclock we are of course using is the Hellfire. Now, this makes it so that way you have less ammo, charge speed, and trail duration with the weapon overall, but it also makes it so that way any enemy that is hit by the trail is heated up and will eventually light on fire, which can also tie into our strategy very well, as it means the coil gun is also able to light enemies on fire. To help build the coil gun out for what we want to do, there are a couple different ways that you can build it, but this is what I decided to go with. In tier 1, I chose the resonance tuning to give us a little bit of an extra trail duration to potentially light enemies on fire faster. However, you could also go with the larger battery for more ammo, since the ammo is taking a bit of a hit thanks to this overclock as well. In tier 2, I went with the optimized magnetic circuits just to give us a little bit of a faster charge up speed. In tier 3, I chose the concussive shockwave to potentially stun enemies and cause them to be stuck in the burning trail longer, so that way way they can light on fire, which could be very useful. Tier 4 is kind of up to you and doesn't necessarily play into the build a whole lot. I decided to go with Shockwave just to give me a little bit more close range damage possibilities, but you could also go with the defense enhancement and be fine as well. And then lastly, of course, in Tier 5, we of course are going with the Necrothermal Catalyst, as I stated earlier. Next, going over the upgrades for the rest of the gunner's equipment. For the zipline launcher, I'm using a very standard setup with just the extra ammo bags in Tier 1 and the disconnection protection in Tier 3, which is still an upgrade that I love to say. For the shield generator, I'm running the standard setup that I like to use, which is the larger area in Tier 1 and then the extra durations in Tiers 2 and 3. And then of course for the armor rig, I'm running the standard setup that I like to use, which is improved generator in Tier 1, healthy in Tier 2, and breathing room in Tier 3. So going over my final thoughts on this particular build, this is a very fun one that, as I said in the beginning, is relatively easy to use and does not require a crazy amount of brain power. Pretty much everything that this build does feeds into itself, and all of the parts of it can play off of each other very well. Again, if you're using the napalm infused rounds for the Hurricane, it is a very self-fulfilling build. Just by using the weapons normally as you would, you are going to do insane amounts of damage and be able to take out crowds of enemies incredibly easily with things like Necrothermal Catalyst and the Hellfire for the coil gun, or just the Hurricane itself is good at taking out crowds as well. And even bigger things like Praetorians and Oppressors are not that big of an issue for you, as you just have so much raw damage output as well if you just focus on them that it's not really going to be much of an issue. Again, things like Dreadnoughts are probably your only real Achilles heel, as they are hard to light on fire, but in that case, you might just want to do some slight alterations to the build itself, and instead of running Hellfire and Necrothermal for the coil gun, you could run something like just the Mole in order to take them out very quickly. Anyway, I hope you guys found this build video enjoyable. If you did, please be sure to check out the other build videos I've done, and be sure to do all that fun stuff like subscribe, like, and even consider becoming a member today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rock and Stone Miners, I will see you guys in the next video.